and my older brother, Cameron, were doing a camping trip on the East Coast. Cameron chose the site and everything, like he usually did, and I just tagged along. He chose well, though. The campsite was really nice, and since we had to hike to get there, it wasn't crowded. There was nobody around, from what we could see. The campsite wasn't very defined, though. It was hard to tell if we were even in the right spot. There were several openings in the trees that looked like they could have been the place we were supposed to be at, but neither of us thought it mattered. We set up on one of the grassy openings, and while we initially thought this place wasn't very active, we started to notice we were wrong. There were leftover things scattered around. Nothing big, like entire tents or anything, but just small things, like a trekking pole or some old shoes. It wasn't normal for these things to be left behind, though, not at campsites like this that were far out. We both thought it was weird, but we went on with our day. We didn't really do much, just hung out and talked. When it got darker out, we lit up a fire and sat around it. A couple hours into the night, I happened to spot something behind Cameron. I pointed it out, not sure what it was. Both of us looked, and after a few moments, we were able to tell that it was a small campfire. It was really far out and partially blocked by all the trees, but the tiny orange flame was flickering in the distance. Had it not been for the moonlight being covered by the clouds and the absolute darkness of the woods, there was no way we would have been able to notice it. I guess we weren't alone, though. It was a little odd that they were out in that direction, because it seemed like it was just forest over there, no openings or anything to really set up a campsite. Maybe they wanted to be away from other people or something. We didn't think about it too much. We got some snacks and drinks out and talked ourselves into exhaustion. We put out the fire and went to bed around midnight. I fell asleep pretty comfortably, not having any trouble at all, though I woke up at some point in the night. It must have only been an hour or two after I'd gone to sleep. I knew exactly why I'd woken up, though. I drank a bit too much right before bed. Needing to relieve myself, I got up and unzipped the tent. I walked out maybe 50 feet from the campsite to make sure I didn't attract any animals, and did my business. But as I was out there, I noticed the flame way out in the forest was still lit up. Maybe it was because I was tired, or just out of it for some reason, but I stood there and stared at it for a minute. I don't even know why, but my eyes began adjusting to the dark as I stood there, and as I looked out into the woods, I suddenly noticed something else. It looked like a figure somewhere far out between me and the distant flame I was looking at. I felt a shock for a moment, but I told myself it couldn't actually be a person. It had to be a weird-looking bush or something. Like there was no way someone was out in the dark, outside our camp at this time of night. But I kept looking, trying to make out what I could, when I started to notice more of these figure-looking shadows in the woods. They were so far, and it was so dark, I couldn't tell if my mind was just playing tricks on me. If they were people, though, there were at least 10 or 15 of them, and they seemed to all be looking right at me. Another shock ran through me. What the hell is this? I almost thought I was hallucinating. I turned around and hurried back to the tent. I debated for a second whether to wake Cameron up. I knew if it was nothing, I would never hear the end of it, but my gut was telling me otherwise. I opened his tent and shook him awake. He was really confused at first, but I just told him I thought I saw something and wanted a second opinion. He hesitantly got up, and I started to lead him out to where I was. But we didn't get very far. The figures I had seen had moved. They were closer, standing all spread out among the trees. I really hoped at this point I was just seeing things, but I slowly looked back at Cameron and could see the pale, fear-covered expression on his face, his eyes wide open. He saw what I saw. I looked back out, and it was more apparent than ever that these were people. I could see their subtle movements as they stood there and watched us. We backed up towards our tents. Should we leave? I can still vividly remember Cameron's shaky voice as he spoke those words. He was always so confident and sure of what to do. It was terrifying seeing and hearing him like that. I nodded, and neither of us grabbed any of our stuff, aside from the car keys and our wallets. We hurried away and down the trail. It seemed that they didn't follow us. We reported what happened to the police, feeling it was necessary. They didn't take it too seriously, though, very clearly thinking we were crazy. Like there was no way a whole group of people were out in the woods at night messing with us. We thought about the strange amount of left-behind things we saw in the area, and that hoped others had already gone to the police about similar encounters. But nobody had. There were no official accounts of anything happening there. Maybe they just went unreported. Or maybe nobody ever made it back to report it. I've always liked being out in the woods by myself. It's a break from the rest of the world, just me, nature, and some long stretches of quiet. I set out early in the morning with my gear loaded in the back of my car. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, hike into a spot I'd heard about, set up my tent, and spend a day or two hunting. When I got there, I was pleased to find the place nearly empty. The trail parking area was small, and not a single vehicle was in sight. Perfect. I hiked in, found a decent spot near a creek, and pitched my tent. By afternoon, I had a small campfire going, and was enjoying a quick meal before heading out with my rifle. I walked deeper into the forest, following a faint trail that eventually vanished beneath fallen leaves. After a while, I thought I saw someone else moving between the trees. He was far off, just a shape flickering through the gaps in the branches. My first thought was another hunter, but he wasn't on any trail I recognized. He was weaving through dense brush, moving quickly. I considered calling out to let him know I was there, just basic safety protocol, but I held back. Something about how he was moving made me uneasy, like he was deliberately trying not to be seen. Eventually, he vanished from sight. I chalked it up to my imagination and carried on. I didn't have any luck hunting that day. The sun started dipping low, so I trudged back to my campsite. The forest was absolutely still, not a breeze, not a single chirp of a bird. Sometimes the woods can feel eerily quiet, but I tried not to let it bother me. I ate a quick dinner by my campfire and then ducked into my tent to get some sleep. Sometime in the night, I was jolted awake by a distant cracking sound. It took me a moment to realize it was a gunshot. Then another. It wasn't necessarily odd to hear gunshots if there were other hunters around, but this was well after dark, and the hunting area was restricted to daylight hours. My pulse quickened, but I tried to calm myself. Accidents happen, or maybe it was just someone chasing off a wild animal. I was drifting in and out of uneasy sleep when I heard something else. Soft, shuffling footsteps just outside my tent. My heart pounded so loudly that I was sure they could hear it. The steps paused, and then I heard a muffled whisper. Another voice responded. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard something like, "Should we check inside?" My mind was racing. Check inside. Did they mean my tent? I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. For several seconds I heard rustling, and then one of them said, "Not now. Let's go." The footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, straining to hear any hint that they might come back. Eventually, I decided it was too risky to spend the rest of the night. I quietly gathered my essentials, stepped out as silently as possible, and hurried to where I'd parked my car. The entire walk felt like something out of a nightmare. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept imagining those voices right behind me. When I reached my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and sped off, not caring if I scraped the bottom on the rough road. My only thought was putting as much distance between me and that campsite as possible. Adrenaline kept my hands tight on the steering wheel. Finally, I made it to the highway. It was late, well past midnight, and I could barely keep my eyes open. My plan was to find the nearest motel, just to be in a place with other people around. About an hour later, I spotted a flickering neon sign that promised vacancy. I pulled in, parked, and checked in. The woman at the front desk barely looked up from her phone as she handed me the key. Inside the room, I tried to settle down, but my nerves were shot. The place was shabby, dim lighting, a musty smell, stained carpet. It was still safer than the campsite though, so I threw my bag on the chair and sank onto the bed. I just needed a couple of hours of sleep, I told myself. Then I'd figure out what to do in the morning. Around 3 in the morning, I was stirred by the sound of something scraping outside. I thought maybe it was just the wind. Then I heard a soft tap on the window. I froze and listened. Another tap. Slowly I got out of bed, heart thrumming, and moved toward the window. The curtain was thin, but in the dim security light outside, I saw a tall silhouette. Someone was definitely out there. Before I could decide what to do, there was a knock at the door. My stomach lurched. With my voice shaking, I called out, "Who is it?" A man's voice responded quietly, "I need to talk to you about the forest incident." My head started to spin. Forest incident? There's no way this was just a coincidence. I quietly slid the chain lock into place on the door and grabbed my phone. I told him to leave, but he said he just had to settle something. His tone was almost polite, which made it more unnerving. Without waiting for another second, I called the police. I only managed to sputter out a few words, something about a strange man trying to talk to me about gunshots in the forest. The dispatcher said officers were on their way and told me to stay inside. I stood there, phone in hand, waiting. The man spoke again from behind the door, but I couldn't make out what he said. Then, everything fell silent. No footsteps, no more knocking, nothing. When the police arrived, surprisingly fast, they found no one outside. They asked me a few questions, shone their flashlights around the parking lot, and took my statement. There was no sign of the man. They checked the security cameras, but the motel's system was old and apparently out of order. I had nothing but my word about what happened. The officers left after telling me to lock my door and call them if anything else came up. I was wide awake, adrenaline still coursing through me. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. At dawn, I checked out and drove straight home, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe the shots were from poachers, or maybe something else was going on in those woods. That man, I still have no clue who he was. Was he one of the voices I heard in my tent? Was he the same figure I saw among the trees? I'm an immunologist. I may just have ended our species. Sorry'd like to start off with an apology. If I am correct, I may just have killed you and everyone you know. Hopefully that isn't the case. But if it is, sorry. I've been working as an immunologist for the past 17 years, and I'm quite well known for my work. Throughout my life, I've lost people I cared about to disease. My mother died from tuberculosis when I was 5. My best friend died of leukemia when I was 16. And my father has recently been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. I've always viewed it as a malicious and evil thing that robs us of our family and friends. It's for this reason that I chose to study the immune system. It's truly a fascinating thing. Our bodies are somehow incredibly resilient and terribly delicate at the same time. My goal was to contribute to the eradication of disease. Well, I suppose the same can be said for all immunologists, but I worked with a fiery hatred for pestilence and sickness. I wanted, in a sense, to get revenge on the being I had made up in my head, this evil figure I had conjured up to personify disease. I was after more than just one. I didn't want to be the man who ended cancer or AIDS. I wanted to rid humanity of the greatest threat it ever had. My goal was to end as many diseases as I possibly could with one strike. I'll keep my explanations as brief as I can, I know. You didn't come here for a science lesson. The human immune system is incredibly complex and has a vast array of countermeasures it uses to kill off pathogens. However, this all relies on the first step of the process, recognition. In order for anything to happen, some immune cell needs to come into contact with the foreign body afflicting the host. This can be any number of cells: T cells, B cells, macrophages, dendritic cells, NK cells, the list goes on. Once this happens, Receptors on these cells bind to specific surface proteins on the pathogen, which starts the next step of the process. The pathogen is engulfed and digested. Afterwards, the cell takes pieces of this now dead pathogen and brings it to other immune cells to activate more immune responses. After a long list of signaling pathways, the host produces antibodies which bind to the pathogens and flag them for destruction. Later, when one of the many killer cells encounters a pathogen marked by antibodies, it will be swiftly eliminated. This process can apply to all types of diseases, bacterial, viral, even cancers. So, why can't we just synthetically make a bunch of antibodies and shoot them into sick people? Well, there are many reasons, actually. But one of them is the issue of immune response recognition. When your immune system goes out to kill targeted cells, how does it know which cells are good and which are bad? The answer is a molecule called sialic acid. Your cells produce this on their surfaces so that even if an immune cell binds to them, it can recognize the sialic acid structures on the surface and move on from it. But some diseases, disgusting and vile as they are, have evolved to use this to their advantage. Some of the most dangerous diseases are able to coat themselves in sialic acid in order to evade immune detection. For example, influenza binds to sialic acid on respiratory cells to gain entry into your lungs. Some bacteria, like Neisseria meningitidis, actually steal sialic acid from their host to create a disguise, and one of the reasons cancer is so difficult to treat is that cancer cells overproduce sialic acid, effectively wearing a do not kill sign that prevents immune cells from recognizing them as threats. This allows all of them to go about their business killing innocent people and spreading to others. To combat this, humans have developed a treatment, one mainly for cancer, using sialidase, an enzyme that breaks down sialic acid from molecules. Think of this as a chainsaw that cuts off sialic acid and allows the bad cells to be recognized by your immune system. There's only one problem with this: sialidase is not specific. It will rip off sialic acid from your own cells if it comes into contact with them. But in this enzyme, I saw the key to free us all of the burden of sickness. If I could use a vehicle to ensure that sialidase only comes into contact with non-self cells, I would be able to strip away their advantage and expose them to the immune system. And I had the perfect one. It feels strange to condense years of my life and hard work into just a few sentences. In my studies, I became deeply familiar with the measles virus, an endlessly fascinating entity. You see, measles causes infected cells to fuse together, forming massive clumps called syncytia. If I could modify the virus to carry the sialidase enzyme, these clusters would become their own undoing. As the cells fused, sialidase would strip away the sialic acid from all of them at once, leaving them completely exposed to the immune system's wrath. That's exactly what I did. It was tested on rodents a week ago, and it worked perfectly. But when I tried to get this new treatment approved, I was shot down almost immediately. I was outraged. I had invented a way to eradicate a plethora of life-threatening diseases, and this miracle cure wasn't even going to be considered. Unfortunately, I took matters into my own hands. This drug was going to save my father. I knew it. So I went to the hospital he was being treated at. He's been spending most of his time sleeping. Cancer has a way of draining energy from its victims. I injected him with my treatment quickly. He didn't even wake up. Satisfied, I left the hospital and headed to the lab. The rats needed feeding, and then I could finally relax at home. Only when I saw the rats did I realize my error. In my fervor to create this miracle cure, I had made the same mistake that the human immune system does. I hadn't been specific enough. My goal was to make the measles virus, with sialidase attached to it, bind to any foreign bodies and force them to clump together. This would then allow the enzyme to remove the sialic acid from all of the pathogens and allow them all to be recognized by the immune system. But sialidase isn't specific. It had shorn off the protein that causes the measles virus to bind. The result of this was a free-floating virus that could bind to any cell and shear off its sialic acid, making it a target for the host's immune system. The rats in their cages had partially liquefied, their bodies reduced to a putrid, gelatinous, slurry. Only a few fragments of bone and shredded tissue remained, barely recognizable as what had once been living creatures. A rancid mix of blood and dissolved flesh pooled. At the bottom of the cages, the stench thick and suffocating. Without another thought, I rushed back to the hospital, back to my father's room. But it was too late. I'm not sure why, but it acted quickly, far more so than it had with the rats. My dad had woken from his sleep with agonizing screams. Blood ran from every orifice, his eyes, his nose, his ears, and mouth. He reached out, a semi-solid hand towards me. I could see the veins and muscles through his skin. As he reached out, his hand fell from his arm and splattered onto the floor by my feet. His now milky white eyes rolled into his skull as he fell back into bed. Motionless, his torso caved in on itself, exposing his liquefied organs to the open air. His body was eating itself because of what I had done. Nurses and doctors rushed in and out of the room, but I knew they wouldn't be able to help. An older nurse grabbed my arm and led me outside, but I couldn't hear his words. My ears rung. From what I had seen, what I had caused, I vomited in the flower bed. I didn't know what else to do, so I went home where I'm now drafting this up. There's one more detail about the measles virus that I didn't mention. It's highly contagious. In fact, in unvaccinated populations, it has a 100% infection rate. Not that a vaccine would help anymore. I've modified the virus to the point where a new vaccine would need to be developed. But judging by how fast it worked on my father, I don't think we have that kind of time. Every single one of the people who were in that hospital likely have it, me included. By tomorrow, hundreds of people will be infected. A week from now, thousands or more. But chances are I'll be dead by then. I truly hope I'm wrong. But if I'm not, I really am sorry. A stranger approached my car at night with a warning. Check the back seat. I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for the walk signal. I have my location shared with my sister. And Mom, I keep my wits about me when I'm out in public. And I try not to dawdle after getting into my car. If I had only been more diligent about that last rule, I might not be in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside of my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from picking up a friend's evening shift, and so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store is in an isolated part of town, but I had never felt unsafe in the area. Then again, I'd never been so late at night. The second I exited the store with my purchase, the old cashier closed up shop for the night and turned off all the lights in the building. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to linger in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often has to run errands after dark. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that, due to a recent breakup, my house hasn't felt all that welcoming in the past few weeks. In any case, I was in no rush to return home. I pulled up an episode of The Terror on my phone and settled in to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of blissful peace and quiet before a shout pierced through the night. I looked up from my phone and was surprised to find a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms at me. My car was parked right in front of the store, facing towards the building, and there was only a thin sidewalk separating my vehicle from the store's exterior. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was like she had emerged from the brick wall before me. She rounded my car, coming to a stop beside the driver's side window. She then started pointing at the ground, the universal signal for roll your window down. Fat chance, I thought, though she looked sane and kempt. I had no clue what her intentions were. In fact, I felt pretty vindicated in always locking my car doors immediately after entering. The woman, perhaps seeing I was making no move to exit my vehicle, then told me something no one wants to hear. "Hey," she shouted, "there's someone in your back seat." My mouth went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes raced through my head. I could almost feel the piano wire digging into my neck, the barrel pressing into my temple. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to launch myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew I was aware of their presence, would I even have enough time to run? With one hand on the door handle. I stole a glance into the rearview mirror and saw no one. My car is a compact hatchback, meaning there is very little room for a person to hide in my cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone upon looking into the mirror. My terror fading to confusion, I turned around in my seat, surveying the cabin with my own eyes, and confirmed that there was no one in my back seat. Click. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was barely a foot from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. There were a few more deep clicks as she tried, unsuccessfully, to open the locked door. I raised my gaze, and she gave me an odd smile, as though she and I were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at the woman's face. Her skin was stretched tightly across her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they'd been cut onto her. Her eyes were deep-set and ovate, and her teeth seemed both too small and too numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment to gawk at the face before me, and then I threw my car into reverse and hightailed it out of the lot. For a few disheartening seconds, the woman held onto the door, keeping in step with my vehicle as I backed up. Luckily, she soon let go, and I drove away, my mind racing with the realization that the woman was trying to bait me out of my car. Even more disturbing was the fact that it had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I simply hadn't seen, and what she had wanted from me. I hoped I had narrowly escaped a robbery as opposed to something much more sinister. I got back to my house 20 minutes later, still shaken from my encounter. I rushed inside the house and made sure that all of my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little to soothe my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring up flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. Once I finally fell asleep, my fears followed me from the waking world. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that when I jolted awake some hours later, it was to the sound of a frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming or not. My alarm clock read for 17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the forcefulness of the knocks, there may have been. Slowly, I rose from my bed and inched towards the entryway. I had never before been in such a situation, and was at somewhat of a loss as to how to react. I didn't smell a fire, thankfully, but that didn't mean all was well. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling out my name in a questioning tone. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who is it?" I called back. "Brian," answered the disembodied voice, and relief washed over me. My neighbor, Brian, lived in the house across the street. We weren't close exactly, but I often saw him walking down the block with his dog, Bailey. I turned on the entryway light, but as I was still in my sleepwear, I didn't want to open the door unless I had to. Instead, I called back to him. "What's the matter?" "Well," he began. I heard his voice crack, and he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "No, I don't." "Why do you ask?" "Well, the dog had to go out, and while I was in the yard with him, I thought I saw someone in your front window. Someone who didn't look quite right." I stilled, feeling as though I were in some terrible dream, turning around and glancing down the dark hallway. I wished I had turned on more lights on my way to answer the door. "She followed you home." I thought, "She's in your house with you right now." I was ready to bolt out the door into the cold, but by some miracle, I had just enough presence of mind left to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something was wrong. I stepped away from the door. "Are you all right, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he next spoke, his voice sounded slightly different from before, as though he were testing out a new timbre. "Of course, I just got a bit of a cold here, but I still wanted to check in on you." My voice wavered as I voiced a question to my neighbor. "But your dog, isn't it a girl?" Brian didn't respond. My mind reeled in the tortuous silence, trying to discern whether the threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of complete stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It rotated downwards as far as it could before the lock stopped it, then shook as the person on the other side of my door pulled on the handle. This happened several more times as the person tested my lock, and then there was a powerful bang, as though someone had rammed into my door with all their might. After that, there was silence again. I stood frozen in place for another minute. I had no peephole, but I worked up the nerve to walk into the living room and peer through the blinds into my front yard. In the distance, walking down the street away from my house, was a figure, although I couldn't see the face. Something deep within me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched her walk away into the quiet night, until she disappeared from my view. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I split my time between roaming the perimeter of my house, looking for anything suspicious, and sitting in my kitchen running the events of the night over in my mind. The most likely explanation was that I'd been dreaming. After all, I'd nearly been baited into opening my door to a potential criminal just hours before, so it made sense that I'd have a nightmare about a similar situation. Then again, I had never, in my entire life, had a dream so vivid. Maybe, somehow the woman really did follow me home. She easily could have stuck a tracker on my car. But how in the world did she know Brian's name? And how had she impersonated him so well? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day. I've been haunted by the idea of someone or multiple someones trying to draw me out into the open. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel as though I catch glimpses of the woman in my periphery, of her beady eyes and uncanny smile. I suppose I should try to get some sleep now, impossible as that seems at this point. I just needed to jot this down before I went to bed, in case anything happens to me. And B, you ever think about blindly trusting the warnings of a stranger? I began to hear a voice after I was in a car accident when I was 7. I used to believe it was just survivor's guilt, but yesterday I learned the horrifying truth. I've lived with the voice for 11 years now, 11 years since I first heard the pained whispers drift up from the back of my mind, 11 years since the accident. I don't remember much from before the wreck, probably about the same amount any person does from their first 7 years of life. But I do recall every detail of the day that everything changed for me. Maybe the trauma of it all seared it into my memories. My mother was driving me home from soccer practice, and some of her hair was draped over the back of the headrest. I was seated behind her, and when she refused to stop for ice cream, I grabbed a handful of the blonde strands and tugged hard, distracted for a moment by the sudden pain in her scalp, and turning to yell at me. She ran a red light. I'll never forget the look of terror on the young woman's face in the other car as she was about to T-bone us, nor her screaming expression turning towards the back seat just before the collision. My father was on the board of the highest-rated hospital in the city, and he ensured that we received the best surgeons and the best treatment. The passengers in the other vehicle, a young mother and her son, were not so lucky. Still, it was a miracle that I survived. The impact was right behind our car's driver's door, right where I was sitting. I should have been crushed, but I did not emerge completely unscathed from the incident. My face was shredded by broken glass and twisted metal, my larynx battered to permanently alter my voice, my eyes damaged such that I was declared legally blind, though losing the majority of my sight was probably for the best, as I was unrecognizable. With extremely powerful glasses, I was able to see just enough of my reflection to recoil in horror, the only time that I ever felt brave enough to look into the mirror with them on. My parents found me sobbing in the restroom and calling myself a monster that morning. A few days later, they told me that we were moving away, that they were wanting to avoid me having to return to school and the onslaught of difficult questions or cruel ridicule from the children that knew me before. Clear across the country, we went from West Coast to East, leaving everything behind, including all of the photographs of me taken prior to the accident, which my mother and father explained they did as a kindness to avoid any reminders of how I used to look. We were starting a new life, and they seemed intent on addressing the accident and my disfigurement from it as little as possible. In fact, it seemed at times that they wanted to pretend that it never happened. My mother sustained some superficial damage as well, but she became expertly adept at hiding her scars with makeup, and both of my parents refused to elaborate to anyone that inquired about my injuries, other than to say we were in a car wreck, that I was a perfectly normal little boy whose physical wounds shouldn't define him, and that they would discuss it no further. Often, I appreciated their attitude, as they worked fiercely to ensure that my childhood was no different than any other. But there were days that I wished they would at least be willing to talk to me about it. Like the night that I first heard the voice. 6 months after the accident, we were settled into our new home, and I wasn't quite yet adjusted to my surroundings. So it was not a surprise when I awoke in the pitch black of my room, at some point in the middle of the night, without my glasses. I wasn't able to see the numbers on the clock to tell me exactly what time it was, but the chirp of crickets outside my window and the absolute absence of light told me that it was well beyond my bedtime, and it wouldn't have much mattered if I could see the clock anyway, as I was unable to turn my head to face it. My body was frozen. No matter how much effort I exerted, I couldn't even wiggle a finger. I was petrified. My breaths came rapidly, and I tried to call out for my parents, but my vocal cords refused to vibrate. And then I heard it. "Who are you?" A childlike whisper grated through my head, a voice simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, originating from somewhere in the depths of my brain. "What?" I replied in thought, still unable to speak aloud. "You shouldn't be here." It sounded just as frightened as I was, trembling near to tears. Then, without warning, my left arm moved, absent my command or me willing it to do so. I felt it raise up off the bed and ball its hand into a fist. Open and closed. Open and closed. The fingers curled in and out as if trying to grasp something in the air. "You shouldn't be here," the voice screamed at me, and in instinctual self-preservation, I yelled back at it in my mind, "Stop, leave me alone," willing it to go away with every ounce of strength in my tiny body, and my arm fell back to my side. Then, suddenly, as quickly as it had come on, my paralysis lifted. Sweating profusely, I threw my covers off and ran from my parents' bedroom as quickly as I could. One small benefit to my new condition was that I could navigate much more easily in the dark than others. Most days, I didn't even bother with my glasses as they gave me a headache, and I got very used to finding my way without the benefit of sight. The route from my room to my mother and father's was already memorized, and I was shaking them awake less than a minute after regaining my mobility. It wasn't easy for me to explain to them what had happened, as they were having to translate the hysterical words I managed to gasp out through fierce hyperventilation, but eventually, they pieced together my story of the voice and how I briefly lost control of my body. I expected that they'd be scared too, that they might even take me to the hospital, yet I was shocked when they barely reacted. It's not as if they were cold and uncaring. They did comfort me. My mother rubbed my back while my father described sleep paralysis, saying that that was very likely what I'd experienced, and they kept repeating that it was a perfectly normal thing, even as a young child. I could tell there was something wrong with their logic. Dad noted that sleep paralysis could involve hallucinations, accounting for the voice, and a loss of motor function, accounting for me waking up frozen. However, it didn't elucidate how my arm had moved on its own, or the strange grasping motion it kept repeating. He had no answers for that, other than to tell me that I was okay, that I was safe, that the voice hadn't hurt me, and that the worst part of the experience was only the fear it induced. But he did warn me that it might happen again, and with his warning, he tendered some advice. "If the voice comes back, and you find that you're not in control anymore, just do exactly what you did tonight, okay? Tell it to go away, and that you're in charge," he said. And with no other guidance or plans on how to deal with it, when it did return again and again, that's exactly what I did. As I grew, I learned to live with it. Neither of my parents were willing to discuss it beyond that first night, other than to reiterate my father's instructions, and it only infrequently impacted my existence. By the time I was 12, I had heard it on 9 different occasions, always at night, always awaking me from a deep sleep. The physical manifestations were identical, each instance complete immobility, other than my phantom arm grasping at the air, but the phrases it wormed through my mind changed. Not fair, leave, your fault, stolen. However, every time, it looped back. Around to, you shouldn't be here, and though, on each intrusion, I was able to fend it off by telling it to leave and that I was in control. Every occurrence resulted in pure terror for me. No matter how many times my parents repeated that it was sleep paralysis, and there was nothing to fear long term, I was still worried that one day, it might take over for good, that one day, I would become a passenger in my own body, especially considering that I didn't understand why it was happening. As I mentioned, I didn't have many memories from before the accident, but I was certain that it had never happened before then. I surmised that there must have been something about the wreck that triggered it, and it wasn't until 5 years after it happened that I first heard the term survivor's guilt. My mother was watching a daytime talk show, and they were interviewing guests that had survived traumatic accidents, one of whom described something similar to what I was experiencing. A voice in their head, nagging them for still being alive when others had died. Listening to their story, I found myself empathizing with them, maybe subconsciously. I was punishing myself for causing the accident by distracting my mother. Maybe, you shouldn't be here, was the voice telling me that I shouldn't be alive when it was my fault that other people weren't. But it wasn't a perfect fit for everything the voice said. What did it mean when it told me to leave, or said, stolen? It was more difficult to view those words the lens of survivor's guilt. Yet, it was the best theory I had, and the one that I carried until I was 15. Until I met my best friend, Carl, in freshman homeroom. The first real friend that I made after the wreck. He didn't care how disfigured my face was, or that I couldn't see. A bit of an outcast himself, we quickly bonded, and I shared everything about myself with him, including the details of how I received my injuries. And of the whispers in my head. My father had told me, explicitly, that I should never speak about the voice to anyone else really. He told me never to speak of it at all, but especially not to mention it outside of our house. However, I trusted Carl implicitly. He'd told me about his struggles at home, about his mom's drinking, and his dad's neglect. I didn't think it fair to hold back any details of my life from him. So, it was Carl that gave me my second theory on the origins of the voice, as he didn't agree that it was a simple case of survivor's guilt. He suspected an attachment. Carl was much more into the world of the dark and creepy than I was. He suggested that the spirit of the boy that had perished in the other vehicle may have searched for the nearest living body it could find after it had been ripped from its own, and crept inside. In his words, inhabitation was a much better explanation for what was happening to me than survivor's guilt, and for the first time, I considered that, possibly, what I was hearing wasn't a manifestation from my own mind, but was someone else speaking with me. It would explain why the voice hadn't aged with me over time, why, every night that it returned to me, it still sounded like a scared and angry child. And I had to admit that every phrase the voice had uttered made more sense when viewed from that angle. We theorized that the boy's soul didn't understand what had happened to it, that on nights when I was particularly vulnerable, fast asleep, and emotionally peaceful, it could push me aside and briefly gain control of my body, that it was confused and thought I was the intruder. Leave, stolen, you shouldn't be here. But, though it illuminated why the voice might be saying some of the things that it was, our hypothesis also pointed to a grim conclusion. The boy wanted me out. My fear of one day becoming a guest within my own body grew. Previously, I'd worried that it was just my own brain that would disconnect its physical control from my mental directions, but now I pondered the frightful possibility that there was a spirit trapped within me that was actively trying to take over. However, in addition to the dread, the prospect also filled me with a deep sadness, as the voice had forcefully reminded me several times. It was my fault that it was in this situation. I had distracted my mother. I had caused the accident. It would still be happily residing in its original host if not for me. I asked Carl if there was anything we could do to try and free it, surmising that sending it on would be preferable for it than forever residing in an alien world. He recommended that we try a Ouija board, thinking that we could contact the imprisoned soul, and help it comprehend what had happened, thinking. We might even be able to get it to leave once it realized that it did not belong in this world anymore. Yet, over the next 3 years, we made more than 50 attempts to communicate with the spirit directly, resulting in more than 50 failures, no matter the time of day, the ambience we set, the music, the scents, the incantations. The boy would not speak to us, but he still came to me at night. 8 more visits during those 3 years each time. Angrier than the last, leave, stolen, mine, and each time, he became harder to push out. Each time he held control for longer. Carl was sleeping at my house during the most recent episode and was nearly killed when he attempted to stop the possession. He had awoken to the distressed noises of me struggling for power over my faculties and saw my arm rise from the bed, making the repetitive, squeezing motion I detailed to him. Knowing what was happening, he tried to shake me from the trance, but was unsuccessful in rattling me free. And then I witnessed my own body attack him. Throttling blows landed on Carl's chest and face. I sprang from the bed and pinned him to the floor. Hands that I couldn't stop wrapped themselves around his throat and began to crush down on his windpipe. Leave, I'm in control. Leave, I'm in control. I shouted inside my head, desperately trying to regain power over my fingers, before the life drained from Carl's face, and mercifully, I felt my grasp begin to loosen just as his eyes were rolling back in his head, collapsing onto the floor next to Carl. I heard him coughing and gasping for air while the voice screamed a final, defiant appeal. Before it receded to the depths of my consciousness, give it back. Neither Carl nor I slept the remainder of that night. I apologized over and over for what I'd done to him, but he told me that it wasn't necessary. He knew that it wasn't really me that had attacked him. Yet he began to withdraw from our friendship. Up to that point, I think Carl had found my affliction to be a curiosity, something fun and mysterious to investigate. However, the attack had exposed the true reality of it to him, and he became just as afraid of it as I was. And any time that I asked him to hang out after that night, he made an excuse. The voice took the only real friend that I had in the world, and it made me furious. 11 years had passed since the accident. 11 years the voice had been punishing me for my mistake. I needed to be free of it. So I decided to share my story online on several paranormal forums, asking if anyone could help, looking for a medium or maybe even an exorcist that could pry the unwelcome spirit from me. And yesterday, someone responded, ********, I've been looking for you," began the cryptic message in my inbox. It's not a spirit you're hearing. Below those words, 2 photographs were pasted, one of my parents with me before the accident, and one of a young woman with 2 boys. A screaming face flashed through my mind, the young woman moments before her car impacted ours. And here she was again, smiling with her sons flanking her on either side. The older boy I didn't recognize, but the younger was familiar. I flicked between the 2 photos and realized how similar my younger self looked to her younger son. Similar age, similar hair color, similar eye color. We might pass for brothers too. But it wasn't just our similarities that bothered me. It had been over 10 years since I'd looked into a mirror with my glasses on. 10 years since I'd seen my face clearly. Or was it his face? I closed my eyes and forced the blurry image from that morning up out of the depths of my memories, and my pulse quickened when it came into focus. Beneath the heavy scarring, under the swelling and bruises, it wasn't the face of the boy with my parents reflected back at me. It was his shaking. I took my laptop with me to the nearest bathroom and looked at myself directly for the first time in a decade. Then, maximizing the image of the mother and her boys on the screen, I imagined what the younger would have looked like, aged 18, and he stared back at me in the mirror. That moment, a splitting headache ripped through my skull, and I dropped to the floor. Grasping my head, I shrieked in pain while a series of images cascaded through my brain. I was seeing the accident again, though not from my perspective. I was seeing it from his. My mother's car flew into the intersection, and it was too late for his mother to stop. She screamed and reached for the back seat where he was seated, and he stretched forward with his left hand to grab her arm. He was closing his fist to squeeze it just as the impact threw her through the windshield, and an instant later, everything went black. He awoke in the hospital weeks later, but was no longer the one in charge of his body. A new director had been installed. I'd been installed. The boy could hear my thoughts. He could see my memories. He knew an invader had taken control of his life, but he was powerless to do anything about it. And he watched as a man he didn't recognize shook hands with a surgeon, thanking him for saving his son's life, thanking him for being willing to perform such a radical procedure in order to do it. As the pain in my head began to wane, and the scene from the hospital was replaced with the bathroom tile I'd toppled onto, I finally understood what the voice was. I understood what my father had done. I understood why my parents had never taken me to a doctor or to therapy to address the voice, why they had been so firm in their assertions. Then I tell it that I was in charge whenever it returned. They already knew what it was. In the boy's memories, it was a neurosurgeon that my father was shaking hands with. They were old friends. He was the one that saved my life, though he'd only saved part of me. The other boy hadn't perished that day, as they'd all lied to me. I had, all but my brain, which they transferred to the surviving boy's body. He wasn't the intruder. I was lying there on the cold bathroom floor. My mind reeled with the horrifying truth that it was now burdened with. I'd made the boy a prisoner, in his own body, sobbing. I pulled myself to my feet and looked again at the anonymous message that had shattered my reality. And I found a few more short sentences beneath the photos. You killed my mother. You stole my brother's body. I will find you. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I don't know what to do. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I crushed my glasses last night, never wanting to catch even a glimpse of my face again. I thought about trying to share control with my roommate, but beyond having no idea how go about that, I'm terrified of what he'll do if I give him the reins. Because now that I know for sure he's in there, now that I know the voice isn't survivor's guilt or a wayward spirit, I can feel him. He's stewing there in the back of our head, scared, furious, mutinous. He knows his brother is looking for him, and he's fighting to take over.